December 11th, 1944. The Hurtgen forest along the German border lay silent, under a blanket of fresh snow, the temperature hovering just below freezing. Corporal James Mitchell of the 28th Infantry Division had been in position for 6 hours, his breathing measured and controlled despite the cold seeping through his wool uniform. He believed this would be another routine observation shift, perhaps spotting a patrol or two, before rotating back to the company command post. He had no idea he was about to demonstrate a technique so unusual that it would be studied in military academies for decades to come, or that before dawn broke, his actions would fundamentally change how his entire division approached nighttime operations. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What transpired in those dark hours would reveal that the greatest weapon was not always the one that made the loudest sound, but the one guided by a mind that could read patterns invisible to others. Mitchell was not your typical infantry soldier. Before the conflict, he had been a naturalist and wildlife photographer in the forests of Oregon, spending months at a time tracking elk and mountain lions through dense timber. He had developed what he called shadow reading, an ability to detect the presence of animals not by seeing them directly, but by observing how they disturbed their environment. The absence of normal forest sounds, the way branches moved differently when brushed by something living versus wind, the subtle patterns in snow that revealed recent passage. His platoon sergeant, Thomas Harker, had noticed this unusual skill during a reconnaissance patrol 3 weeks earlier, when Mitchell had detected an enemy observation post, simply by noting that the birds in one section of forest had gone silent while continuing their calls elsewhere. Harker, a career soldier from Philadelphia who had fought in North Africa before transferring to the European theater, initially dismissed Mitchell's methods as superstition, but after the corporal accurately predicted the location of 3 separate enemy positions using nothing but environmental observation, Harker began to see potential in this unconventional approach. He brought Mitchell's abilities to the attention of Captain Robert Chen, the company commander, who had graduated from West Point just 2 years before the conflict began. Chen was young for his rank, but possessed an open mind about tactical innovation, having read extensively about unconventional warfare techniques used by resistance movements across occupied Europe. The captain made a decision that would prove both controversial and inspired. He assigned Mitchell to a forward observation position with specific instructions that differed dramatically from standard protocol. Instead of simply reporting enemy movement, Mitchell was authorized to take direct action against targets of opportunity, but only under specific conditions. He was to eliminate enemy personnel who were isolated from their units, ensuring each engagement occurred without alerting nearby forces. The goal was not simply to reduce enemy numbers, but to create a psychological effect, making the opposing forces feel vulnerable even in areas they considered secure. Mitchell established his position in the hollow trunk of a massive oak tree that had been shattered by artillery fire weeks earlier. The tree stood on a small rise overlooking a network of trails the German forces used for moving supplies and rotating troops between their forward positions and rear areas. From his vantage point, Mitchell could observe nearly 800 meters of forest in multiple directions. He had spent 2 full days preparing the position, carefully clearing sight lines while ensuring the disrupted vegetation looked natural, creating multiple firing ports that were invisible from ground level, and establishing 3 separate escape routes in case his position was discovered. His equipment was specialized for this mission. Mitchell carried an M1903 Springfield rifle fitted with an 8-power uninertal scope, a weapon that had been the standard sniper rifle of American forces since the previous world conflict. The rifle fired the .30-06 cartridge, capable of accurate fire out to 1,000 yards, in the hands of a skilled marksman. But Mitchell's most important tools were not military issue. He carried a small leather journal in which he had spent weeks documenting patterns of enemy movement through this sector, noting times, group sizes, and behavioral patterns. He also carried his grandfather's pocket watch, a Hamilton Railroad-grade timepiece accurate to within seconds per week, which he used to track the precise timing of enemy activities. The German forces in this sector belonged to the 275th Infantry Division. a unit that had been reconstituted after heavy losses on the Eastern Front. The division was composed primarily of older soldiers and young recruits with limited combat experience. Supported by a corps of veterans who provided tactical leadership, they had established a defensive network in the Hurtgen forest that took advantage of the terrain's natural obstacles and dense vegetation. Their doctrine emphasized maintaining secure rear areas where troops could rest and resupply without constant vigilance. A reasonable assumption given that American forces had not demonstrated aggressive patrol activity in this specific sector. Mitchell understood that his mission required more than just marksmanship. As darkness fell on that December evening, he began the mental process he called reading the shadows. He did not focus his eyes on any single point, but allowed his vision to soften, taking in the entire landscape as a unified whole. This technique, borrowed from his wildlife tracking days, allowed him to detect movement through his peripheral vision, which was far more sensitive to motion than direct focal vision. He listened not for specific sounds, but for changes in the ambient noise pattern of the forest. The creak of branches, the occasional call of a night bird, the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, all created a baseline against which anomalies would stand out. At 2200 hours, precisely on schedule according to Mitchell's journal notes, the first enemy soldier appeared. A supply runner, judging by the pack he carried, moving along the trail with the careful but not overly cautious pace of someone who believed themselves in a secure area. Mitchell tracked him through the scope, noting his route and destination, but held his fire. The runner disappeared into the darkness, heading toward a supply depot Mitchell had previously identified. This was expected behavior, confirmation that patterns were holding despite the fresh snowfall. 30 minutes later, 3 more soldiers appeared, moving in a loose file formation. These were replacement troops rotating to forward positions, their movements awkward and uncertain in the darkness. They stopped twice to consult a map, using a shielded flashlight that briefly illuminated their faces. Mitchell noted they were young, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, and carried their weapons in a way that suggested limited field experience. Again he held fire. These soldiers presented targets, but engaging them would alert the entire network before his real opportunity arrived. The opportunity Mitchell waited for came at 23:45 hours. His journal notes indicated this was when the nightly patrol supervisor made his rounds, checking on the various listening posts and forward positions scattered through the German defensive network. This individual, a sergeant named Klaus Weber, according to documents recovered from a previous engagement, followed an almost ritualistic pattern. He traveled alone, moving between positions with the confidence of someone who had walked these trails dozens of times. Weber carried a distinctive walking stick, cut from local timber, which he used to test suspicious areas of ground and to signal his approach to friendly positions with a specific tapping pattern. Mitchell heard the tapping before he saw movement. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. The signal Weber used to identify himself to sentries. The sound came from Mitchell's left along the main supply trail. He shifted his position slowly, bringing his rifle to bear on the approach vector. Through his scope, he could see the faint outline of a figure moving with purposeful strides, occasionally tapping the walking stick against trees. Mitchell's breathing slowed further. He exhaled completely, let his body settle into absolute stillness, then took a half breath and held it. The shot broke in the pause between heartbeats. The Springfield's report echoed through the forest, a sharp crack that rolled across the hills. Weber collapsed mid-stride, the walking stick falling from his hand. Mitchell was already moving, flowing through his primary escape route before the echo faded. But he did not move far. 30 meters from his original position, he settled into a secondary hide, a depression behind a fallen log that gave him a different angle on the trails. The response was swift but predictable. Within minutes, soldiers began appearing on the trails, called from nearby positions to investigate the shot. They moved in groups of 3 to 5, using flashlights despite tactical doctrine against illumination in potential combat zones. Their voices carried clearly through the cold air, calling for Weber, asking each other what had happened. Mitchell could hear the confusion and growing concern in their tones. Over the next 4 hours, Mitchell systematically engaged targets using a technique that would later be termed isolation targeting. He never fired at groups, only at individuals who had separated from their companions. When soldiers spread out to search the area, he waited until one moved beyond immediate support range of his fellows before engaging. Each shot was followed by immediate relocation to a new firing position. He had prepared 7 such positions in a rough circle around the area, each offering different angles and escape routes. The psychological effect was devastating. The German soldiers found themselves in a nightmare scenario. They could not identify the source of fire because Mitchell never fired from the same location twice. They could not suppress him with return fire because he was constantly moving. They could not mass forces against him because he only engaged isolated targets. Most critically, they could not retreat to safety because they no longer knew where safety was. The rear area they had considered secure had become a hunting ground. Private Hans Zimmermann, a young soldier from Bavaria who survived the night by remaining in a bunker, later described the experience in a letter to his family that was intercepted by Allied intelligence. He wrote that the worst part was not the shooting itself, but the silence between shots. The way they would begin to believe it was over, start to organize a response, and then another shot would ring out from a completely different direction. The way they stopped trusting their own perimeter security. The way every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Mitchell's ammunition supply was limited. He carried 45 rounds, a conservative load chosen to maintain mobility. Each round was hand-loaded to match his rifle's specific characteristics, ensuring maximum accuracy. As the night progressed, he became increasingly selective about targets. He focused on individuals who appeared to be leaders, those giving orders or organizing search parties. He targeted soldiers carrying communications equipment, radios and field telephones that connected the scattered positions. He engaged troops who were attempting to establish more secure perimeters or set up defensive positions. By 0300 hours, the German forces in this sector had effectively ceased functioning as an organized unit. Soldiers refused to move alone. Patrols that ventured out returned quickly, reporting that they could not effectively search in darkness. Officers who attempted to restore order found their commands ignored by troops who had concluded that movement equaled death. The entire defensive network, which covered approximately 2 square kilometers of forest, had been paralyzed by a single rifleman. Captain Chen, monitoring the situation from the company command post via radio reports from forward observers, initially struggled to believe the reports he was receiving. His communications sergeant, a veteran named Michael Torres, who had been with the company since its activation, thought at first that the radio was malfunctioning when the observation posts began reporting the scale of confusion in the enemy rear area. Chen made the decision to send a reconnaissance patrol forward at 0400 hours to verify the situation and locate Mitchell. Lieutenant David Kowalski led the patrol, a squad of experienced soldiers who had been briefed on Mitchell's mission but not on his specific methods. What they found astonished them. The German positions were intact, but abandoned or manned by soldiers who refused to leave their bunkers. Supply dumps sat unguarded. Communication lines had been cut and not repaired. Most striking was the evidence of chaos, discarded equipment, medical supplies scattered where emergency aid had been attempted, and signs that units had repositioned multiple times during the night. Mitchell himself emerged from the forest at 0515 hours, just as the first grey light of dawn began filtering through the trees. He carried his rifle at a casual port-arms position, walking with the easy gait of someone returning from a pleasant hike. His uniform was soaked with melted snow and covered in forest debris, but he appeared otherwise unaffected by the night's activities. When he reached the patrol's position, he simply nodded to Lieutenant Kowalski and reported that the sector was clear for advance. The after-action report filed by Captain Chen documented the mission's results with clinical precision. 81 confirmed enemy casualties, all achieved without friendly losses. An entire defensive sector rendered combat ineffective for approximately 48 hours, while units were reorganized and repositioned. Intelligence gathered from the disrupted positions provided detailed information about the German division's strength, disposition, and morale state. The report also noted the unusual psychological impact of the operation, describing how enemy forces had been immobilized not through superior numbers or firepower, but through a systematic targeting method that exploited their assumptions about rear area security. Mitchell's technique drew intense interest from higher headquarters. Within a week, he was pulled from line duty to brief division and corps-level intelligence officers on his methods. The briefings focused not on marksmanship, which was considered a standard skill among trained sharpshooters, but on the environmental observation techniques he called shadow reading. Mitchell explained how he used the forest itself as an early warning system, how he read patterns in animal behavior to detect human movement, how he timed his observations to match enemy activity patterns, rather than maintaining constant vigilance. Major General Norman Cotter, commanding the 28th Infantry Division, attended one of these briefings personally. Cotter was known as a forward-thinking officer who emphasized tactical innovation and had been decorated for his leadership during the Normandy invasion. After listening to Mitchell's presentation, he authorized the creation of a specialized training program to teach shadow reading techniques to reconnaissance and sniper units throughout the division. The program was conducted by Mitchell himself, working with experienced hunters and outdoorsmen from various units who had similar backgrounds in tracking and field observation. The training program ran for 3 weeks in January 1945, conducted in rotation so that units could maintain operational readiness. 67 soldiers completed the full course, learning not just to shoot accurately, but to read their environment with the same attention Mitchell brought to his work. The program emphasized patience, pattern recognition, and what Mitchell called predictive observation, the ability to anticipate where targets would appear based on understanding their routine behaviors. The impact of this training became evident during subsequent operations. Reconnaissance patrols reported earlier detection of enemy positions and more accurate intelligence about enemy movements. Sniper teams achieved higher success rates with fewer rounds expended. Perhaps most significantly, enemy forces began demonstrating increased caution about movement in their rear areas, requiring larger security details for routine tasks and showing reduced efficiency in their supply operations. The psychological pressure created by knowing that isolated soldiers were vulnerable had effects that rippled far beyond any single engagement. Staff Sergeant Thomas Harker, Mitchell's platoon sergeant, later observed that the most important lesson from that December night was not about shooting technique, but about thinking differently. In a memorandum submitted to division headquarters, Harker wrote that conventional military training taught soldiers to fight against visible enemies, but Mitchell had demonstrated the power of fighting against patterns and routines. By understanding how the enemy organized their activities, it became possible to anticipate their movements and be in position before they arrived. This represented a fundamental shift from reactive to predictive tactics. The German forces in the Hurtgen Forest sector eventually adapted to the new threat. They increased patrol sizes, randomized movement schedules, and established more elaborate security procedures for rear area activities. But these adaptations came at significant cost. Larger patrols meant fewer patrols overall due to limited manpower. Randomized schedules reduced efficiency in supply distribution. Enhanced security procedures slowed the pace of operations. The cumulative effect was a defensive network that was more secure but less effective at its primary mission of holding ground against American advances. Mitchell himself returned to regular duties with his unit in February 1945, though he continued to serve as an advisor on reconnaissance techniques. He participated in the division's advance across the Rhine and into the heart of the former German territories, but never again in the specialized role he had performed that December night. In his personal journal, which he maintained throughout the conflict, Mitchell wrote that the shadow reading technique worked only under specific conditions. It required terrain that provided concealment, an enemy that followed predictable patterns, and a situation where the psychological impact of casualties outweighed their numerical significance. After the conflict ended, Mitchell returned to Oregon and resumed his work as a wildlife photographer and naturalist. He rarely spoke publicly about his military service, considering it a necessary duty rather than a defining experience. However, he did participate in one post-conflict study conducted by the Army's Historical Division. providing detailed descriptions of his methods for inclusion in training manuals. The techniques he described became part of the curriculum at various military schools, though they were often presented in more conventional tactical terms that did not fully capture the intuitive, observation-based approach Mitchell had pioneered. The broader historical significance of that December night in the Hurtgen forest lay not in the specific casualties inflicted, but in what it revealed about the nature of effectiveness in modern conflict. Traditional military thinking emphasized concentration of force and overwhelming firepower. Mitchell demonstrated that under certain circumstances, a single individual with appropriate skills and knowledge could achieve effects disproportionate to conventional expectations. This was not because of any special technology or superior weapons, but because of the ability to understand patterns, predict behavior, and operate at a tempo that kept opponents constantly reacting rather than acting. The lesson resonated through subsequent decades of military thinking. The emphasis on individual skill and knowledge, the value of understanding cultural patterns and behavioral routines, the power of psychological pressure over physical destruction, all became central concepts in later doctrine development. Mitchell's shadow reading technique, though specific to a particular time and environment, represented a principle that transcended its original context. The principle that the human mind, properly trained to observe and interpret, could be as decisive as any technological advantage. For the German soldiers who experienced that night, the impact was deeply personal. Hans Zimmermann, the Bavarian private who survived by remaining in his bunker, carried the memory for the rest of his life. In his later years, after returning to his family's farm near Munich, he would sometimes wake in the night, convinced he heard the crack of a rifle in the distance. He understood intellectually that he was safe, that the conflict had ended decades ago, but the emotional memory of helplessness and fear remained vivid. In conversations with his grandson, who became a military historian, Zimmermann described how that single night changed his understanding of vulnerability. Before that night, he had believed that security came from being surrounded by comrades and defensive positions. After that night, he understood that true security required constant vigilance and an awareness that threats could emerge from any direction at any time. Captain Chen, who authorized Mitchell's mission, went on to a distinguished military career, eventually retiring as a brigadier general. In his memoirs published in the early 1980s, Chen devoted an entire chapter to what he called the shadow reading incident. He wrote that his decision to authorize such an unconventional operation had been controversial at the time, with some staff officers arguing it was an inappropriate use of resources and others questioning whether it was ethical to target isolated soldiers rather than engaging organized enemy units. Chen's response was pragmatic. In his view, the conflict would be won by the side that most effectively disrupted enemy operations while preserving its own forces. Mitchell's mission accomplished both objectives simultaneously. The ethics of Mitchell's targeting method did generate discussion within military circles after the conflict. Some argued that targeting isolated soldiers in what they believed to be secure areas was inconsistent with the principles of honorable combat. Others countered that there was no ethical distinction between engaging enemy forces in rear areas versus forward positions, that all enemy combatants were legitimate targets regardless of their immediate combat role. The Army's official position, articulated in post-conflict analyses, was that Mitchell's actions were entirely consistent with the laws of conflict as understood at that time, as he had engaged uniformed combatants in an active theater of operations. Mitchell's own perspective on this question, expressed in his journal, was characteristically practical. He wrote that he viewed his mission as reducing the combat effectiveness of enemy forces while minimizing risk to American soldiers. He did not consider individual enemy soldiers as personal enemies, but as components of a military organization that needed to be disrupted. His targets were chosen based on tactical significance rather than personal animosity. This professional detachment was perhaps his most remarkable characteristic, the ability to perform an intensely personal form of combat while maintaining emotional distance from its human consequences. The technique Mitchell pioneered had limited direct application in subsequent conflicts. The specific conditions that made shadow reading effective: dense forest terrain, an enemy following predictable patterns. Technology limited enough that individual marksmanship remained tactically significant, became increasingly rare as conflicts evolved. Modern surveillance technology, improved communications, and changes in tactical doctrine reduced the opportunities for a single individual to achieve the kind of asymmetric impact Mitchell demonstrated. Yet the underlying principle, that understanding patterns and exploiting predictability could create decisive advantages, remained relevant and continues to inform military thinking today. For the soldiers of the 28th Infantry Division who participated in the training program Mitchell developed, the experience provided skills that extended beyond immediate military application. Learning to observe environments carefully, to recognize patterns in behavior, to anticipate actions based on established routines, these abilities proved valuable in contexts ranging from law enforcement to wildlife management to business analysis. Several former students of Mitchell's program remained in contact with him after the conflict, occasionally visiting his Oregon home to discuss how they had applied observational techniques in their civilian careers. The December night in the Hurtgen Forest ultimately represented a convergence of individual skill, tactical opportunity, and historical circumstance. Mitchell brought abilities developed through years of wildlife tracking to a military context, where those skills had unexpected application. His commanders had the flexibility and imagination to authorize an unconventional approach. The enemy followed patterns that made them vulnerable to someone who understood how to read those patterns. Remove any of these elements, and the outcome would have been dramatically different. As the decades passed and the veterans of that conflict aged and passed away, the story of Mitchell's shadow reading technique gradually faded from general awareness. It remained preserved in military archives and specialized historical accounts, occasionally referenced in studies of sniper tactics or unconventional warfare. Mitchell himself died in 1993 at the age of 71, his passing noted in local Oregon newspapers, but receiving little attention beyond his immediate community. His personal journals and papers were donated to the Oregon Historical Society, where they remain available to researchers interested in the intersection of natural history skills and military application. The oak tree that served as Mitchell's primary observation post survived the conflict and continued to stand in the Hurtgen Forest for another 4 decades before finally falling during a severe storm in the late 1980s. By that time, the forest had regenerated substantially from the damage it suffered during the conflict, though careful observers could still find evidence of the fighting in the form of rusted metal fragments and the occasional unexploded ordnance. The trails where Mitchell conducted his operation were eventually incorporated into a network of hiking paths maintained by local conservation organizations, walked by visitors who had no knowledge of the events that had transpired there. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.